Welcome to e-flux. We're really, really pleased to have Alberto Toscano and Timothy Mitchell here with us tonight on the occasion of Mariana Silva and Pedro Neves Marquez's exhibition downstairs entitled Environment, which is in its last week now and closes on Saturday. So make sure that you try to see the exhibition before it closes. I'll keep my introduction super short because also Mariana and Pedro want to introduce our speakers. We have a really, really busy month in November with a lot of events. The exhibition following Environments will be by Natasha Salder-Hagigian, an artist from Berlin, whose exhibition called Solo Show is an exhibition by a kind of real fictional artist named Robbie Williams. And the exhibition is focusing on labor conditions and issues of work surrounding production of artworks. And this will have events on November 19th and the 24th. One of those will be actually members of Free Cooper Union doing a reenactment of a conversation that was recorded secretly by the Board of Trustees at Cooper Union. It's about a 2-hour performance, and it reenacts this kind of act of subterfuge and sabotage by the students. On November 13th and 14th, we have a 2-day kind of mini conference on accelerationist aesthetics, which is on the occasion of our summer issue of e-flux Journal, which was guest edited by Jean Moreno. And for that, we were really excited to have Mackenzie Bork and Stephen Shapiro, Keller Easterling, Daniel van der Velden from Metahaven, and Ben Bratton coming here for 2 nights in a row. And so try to make up for that. I'll turn it over now to Mariana and Pedro. Thanks a lot.
Hello. So I'm very happy to introduce Timothy Mitchell and Alberto Toscano. I just wanted to read a very short presentation and about their work. So Timothy Mitchell is an excerpt on modern history in the Middle East with a focus on Egypt. His latest book has investigated the history of coal and oil. Among many qualities, one of the aspects that makes his work so special is how he writes from the perspective of the materials of coal and oil itself, perhaps pointing towards an ontology-centered history of what he calls carbon democracies. In this way, he highlights how oil constructed a centralized energy system capable of disrupting traditional labor struggles, reconfiguring the workforce, and contributing to the understanding of the economy as a global system of endless growth beyond physical limits. Alberto Toscano, besides his vast work in translating Alain Badiou to English, has written on contemporary forms of contemporary labor, finance, value, image making, and the dynamics between abstraction and materiality under capitalism. Today, he will address how the material conditions of accumulation and circulation of capital are increasingly perceived as pressure points for political action, from military strategies for switching cities off to port blockades that revisit the tactics of class struggle in carbon democracies. Just a short bio, more concrete kind of. Timothy Mitchell teaches in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University and is a long-standing expert on modern geopolitics of the Middle Eastern region with a specific focus on Egypt, as I said before. His books include the recent Carbon Democracy, Political Powers in the Age of Oil, Verso 2011, and Colonizing Egypt, University of California, 1991. He is the editor of Questions of Modernity, University of Minnesota, 2000, and a new edition of the book Rule of Experts, Egypt, Technopolitics, Modernity, that will appear next year. Alberto Toscano teaches in the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths University, University of London. He is the author of Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea, Verso 2010, Theater of Production, Philosophy, and Individuation Between Kant and Deleuze, Palgrave Macmillan, 2006, and the forthcoming Cartographies of the Absolute with Jeff Kinkle. He is a member of the editorial board of Historical Materialism, and is the series editor of the Italian list at Siegel's book. Thank you very much, and we're both going to.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for coming. I'm just going to spend half an hour or so outlining this book that I published just over a year ago called Carbon Democracy, and laying out what I learned in writing that book. And then raising a few questions at the end, which I think will probably connect well with the kinds of questions and issues that Alberto wants to raise after me. The argument of carbon democracy is almost embarrassingly simple. It can be boiled down to a single sentence. Coal created the possibility for modern mass democracy, and oil set its limits. I began writing the book 5 or 6 years ago, in the aftermath of the US invasion of Iraq, and in a time and in a period in which there was a lot of debate about this problem of oil and democracy, that somehow oil seemed to be a curse that made democratic politics more difficult in countries that produced large amounts of it. I found those kinds of arguments that circulated with increasing frequency after the US invasion of Iraq not particularly illuminating. I realized that one of the reasons for that was that in attempting to understand why oil seemed to be a curse, very few of those writing about this actually looked at the oil. They looked at the money. They looked at the enormous profits that could be gained from oil. And that's actually the case whether talking about oil states or oil corporations. That it's the extraordinary profit or income that can be gathered that seem to be, in most accounts, the nature of the problem. I remember reading, and that what followed from that was that somehow that money was used to corrupt democratic processes or to buy people off or otherwise disturb what might have been the normal emergence forms of popular democracy. And it seemed to me that underlying that was a rather misleading and simple notion of the democratic. And I remember reading an account by one of the early accounts of the U.S. occupation of Iraq that described a U.S. democracy expert who was traveling around the south of the country, where local councils were being set up as a form of proto-democracy. And the members of one of these Iraqi councils were addressed by this US expert, and who said apparently, "Welcome to your new democracy." He had PowerPoints to accompany his talk. I have met you before, he said. I have met you in Cambodia. I have met you in Russia. I have met you in Nigeria. At which point 2 members of the council walked out. That was the notion, first of all, that democracy is the same thing everywhere, and that you can carry it around and install it in one place or another as a set of rules or procedures. That the democracy, as it were, is a sort of carbon copy. Each time it's produced, it's somehow based on a similar set of institutions and rules and practices. I wonder if I should stand up. I just feel like I can't see about 2/3 of you. Oh, that's better. Will this work? Oh, is this going to create problems for the camera? We'll try and work this way. A particular version of democracy is being the same thing everywhere. You can carry it around from place to place, from occupation to occupation, in your briefcase with your PowerPoint slides. And that therefore democracy is always somehow reproduced as this kind of carbon copy of itself. And you can do that because it exists fundamentally, as in so many liberal theories of democracy, as essentially an idea. It's a matter of an idea being put into place, put in people's heads, written out in constitutions. It didn't seem to me a particularly useful way of thinking about the problems of democracy and making sense of the role of oil in problems of democracy. And an alternative way to think about this was to begin with the oil itself. You could do that more recently with the Arab Spring, the revolutionary movements that were referred to briefly as the Arab Spring over the last 2 or 3 years. Curiously, looking at the oil produces an interesting map of the occurrence of those revolutionary movements. You could divide the countries of the Arab world into 3 groups: those with an awful lot of oil, those with no oil, and those with just a bit. The countries with just a bit of oil in the Middle East are Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen. And this isn't a talk about the Arab Spring, but it would be interesting to start connecting the emergence of those revolutionary movements not to an abundance of oil, not to the absence of oil, but to a particular relationship of oil to oil of those that had a bit of it, but not enough. But I was also interested in thinking not only about the relationship of oil to democracy in regions like the Arab world that have a lot of the oil, but also in relation to the West, because of course oil is also a problem for democracy and for democratic politics in the West. In a couple of very obvious ways. We're dealing on the one hand with the problems of the peaking of the availability of conventional forms of oil, the price of oil moving from about $25 a barrel to $50 a barrel, and then doubling again because of the increasing difficulty of extracting it, and that being a significant factor in triggering the global financial crisis of 2008. But also, of course, the much larger problem of what's happening to the climate and the threat of catastrophic climate collapse. So that there's a certain way in which our use of oil, our dependence on oil, represents a set of problems, whether over future sources of energy or the future viability of forms of collective life, that the kinds of democratic procedures that emerge to govern collective life, even in democratized countries of the West, seem completely incapable of addressing and thinking about. So if there's a problem of oil and democracy, it doesn't only seem to be one that applies to those that depend on the export of oil, but also places, perhaps more so in places that depend upon the consumption of very large amounts of oil. But beyond those 2 problems of oil and democracy in the West, there seemed to be another one, and that was one that one could understand if one thought about the difference between the role of coal in the history of democracy and the role of oil. And there was a way in which, historically, oil itself, as it became the dominant source of energy and the dominant fossil fuel, in the second half of the 20th century, was actually part of a de-democratizing, not only of Arab producer states or other producer states, but a de-democratizing process in the West. And leaving aside the very problematic futures we may be facing in relation to the use of carbon energy, even just looking back over the last half century, there's been a very interesting way in which oil itself has interacted with our political process. To make sense of that in the book, what I decided to do was to think not initially about oil and democracy, but about coal and democracy. There's a very standard story told about coal and the rise of mass democracy. That coal was associated with the development of steam power with the Industrial Revolution, industrialization with the growth of large cities with the emergence of mass politics and the development of the forms of mass democratic politics of the early 20th century onwards. But I think actually looking much more closely about how that history happened, one sees a much more particular way in which coal operated in that system, not just as a new source of energy, but as a very particular source of political vulnerability that had not previously existed. What happened was that for the first time in history, in the course of the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, industrializing countries became dependent on a single source of energy. Previous to the rise of coal, of course, most energy was, in a sense, solar. Whether you used wood that depended on sunlight for the growth of forests, or whether you used animal energy and pasture land, or whether you grew food, whether you used water power, wind power, energy was essentially solar, and tended to be very, very widely distributed. The difference with switching from those renewable forms of energy to energy from fossil fuels was not just the enormous increase in the concentration of energy, because coal contains so much energy in such a relatively small amount of volume, but that there's a much greater quantity of energy available, but also the sites where that energy is available become much more concentrated. Energy is now not distributed across fields and farmlands and woods and rivers and across a whole territory, but it's coming out of very specific sites, coal mines. It's being moved along railways, it's being loaded at docks, and it's being taken to places of manufacture and to places of generation of electricity and so on. And that produced this very unusual vulnerability, which led to a very particular political possibility, the possibility of the general strike. As late as the 1870s, Engels ridiculed the idea of the general strike, likening it to sort of early 19th century ideas of sort of declaration of a mass holiday. And there were particular reasons, because he said the kind of organizing power you would need to actually shut down the entire productive system of a country to carry out this effective general strike, you would already be so organized politically. You would by definition be more powerful than the state itself. And in 1870 there didn't seem to be a way that political organization could work except on that state-like scale. If you were already as powerful as the state, then the general strike would be an unnecessary detour. You could already replace the state. A decade and a half later, the situation has changed. And the change is the vulnerability created by this dependence on coal. Relatively small groups of workers had the ability, for the first time in history, to shut down productive systems of an entire country because you could locate the point of political vulnerability, which was the coal mine, the coal face, the place where coal was moved onto railways, the vital switching points of railways, the place where it's unloaded when it's moved onto other forms of transportation and where it's consumed. And so workforces, they didn't even necessarily have to be coordinated among themselves, because it was the actual network of the movement of energy gave them the coordination, could suddenly threaten to shut down entire economies. And the phenomenon of the general strike, which arises in the late 1880s, 1890s, lasts as a kind of political weapon through to somewhere in the mid-20th century. It transforms politics. It transforms from the politics in industrialized countries, from a limited forms of representative government in the hands of small elites, to the forms of mass democracy that came into being, in which workers and working parties were able to successfully fight for and demand a vast amelioration in the conditions of working life across most of the industrialized countries. Basic things like forms of retirement pension, health care, insurance against accidents at work, and many, many other of the basic forms of welfare democracy were brought into being, either directly as a result of the threat of strikes or in anticipation of the forms of radical politics that were now possible. And of course the vote was also extended to all of adult male populations and then to women populations. So there's a very peculiar and specific relationship between coal and democracy that the book traces. In the middle decades of the 20th century, and particularly after the Second World War, there's a massive shift from the use of coal to the use of oil. And the question then presents itself, well, why couldn't you do the same thing with oil? Why couldn't you produce the same kinds of choke points, points of vulnerability, and use them politically to fight for the same kind of changes in places that were now important to the production of energy in the oil age? Well, the attempt was made, and if you read the history, I trace some of this in the book, of Iraq in the 1920s and 30s, of Iran in the 1930s and 40s, and Saudi Arabia in the 40s and 50s. You find wave after wave of strike movements, of well-organized political parties, mostly communist parties in most of those countries, based in the oil workers in particular, and also in the railroad workers, pipeline operators, demanding the same things that had been demanded 50 years before by industrialized workers in the West, initially beginning with working rights, the right to unionize, but then more broadly, if you look at Saudi workers in the 1940s and 50s, demanding a political constitution, demanding an end to the US role in the country's political system. And the same thing in Iran, the same thing in Iraq, right through that period. They're much less successful, as we know. Most attempts to explain that lack of success fall back on various forms of cultural argument, which don't seem to me particularly useful. And I think it's better, again, to begin with the energy itself and some of the differences between coal and oil. Partly, it's just coming second. If your attempts at political transformation are based on a second form of energy, you don't have quite the same ability to interrupt things now that there are these two alternative forms of energy. Partly, it's the place. Industrialization has already happened elsewhere, but now the energy for industry is being produced at a very great distance from the sites where most of that energy is being produced. The energy is coming from the Middle East. It's being produced for countries that are already industrialized using coal. So you're just, as you attempt to organize politically, you haven't got the close connection of railroads and docks and miners and so on that you had before. But you've also got the physical properties of oil. Oil tends to come out of the ground under its own pressure, so you don't have to send people down underground, so you don't have the kind of autonomous workspaces that you had with coal mining. You have a workforce that is much smaller in relation to the amount of energy, and that is concentrated on the surface, where it's more easily supervised. And then the oil is liquid, so that it can be put into pipelines and pumped into pipelines rather than being manually loaded, as coal used to be. And from those pipelines pumped again with very little human labor into tankers, and the tankers can move it across the sea. In fact, not just across the sea, as happened with coal, but across oceans. Historically, very little coal crossed oceans. It was just too heavy in relation to the amount of energy to make it worthwhile. There were exceptions, but that was the general pattern. Oil being much lighter in relation to the amount of energy it contains, it was feasible to move it across oceans, and therefore oil produced anywhere in the world could be sold anywhere else in the world. That meant that any attempt to interrupt the supply of energy could easily be circumvented by shipping energy supplies from another source. So whereas coal ran on rail lines which were more or less fixed and went between connected places of production and use of energy, the kind of lines that oil moved on were this much more network-like space of ocean shipping, where if one particular node was blocked, you could move to a different node and take the energy supply elsewhere. And that flexibility meant that those who were producing energy and using it, or who controlled the production use of energy, could much more easily evade attempts at interruption or the organizing of political protest over the ability to interrupt the supply of oil. At the same time, so one last thing about that, so one can think about that moment somewhere around the middle of the 20th century, if you like, when this alternative source of energy starts to be developed in a significant way, the oil of the Middle East and other regions around the world. There's an interesting moment not only in the politics of those countries that are going to become the major oil producers and going to have this much more difficult
form of democratic struggle, but also in the history of democracy in the West. You're probably familiar with the ways in which, much more recently, a process of deindustrialization in the West has been based on the outsourcing of production, of manufacturing production, to countries elsewhere in the world, to Mexico, to parts of South Asia, to East Asia, and so on. And that, of course, has undermined all kinds of powers of organized workforces in the industrialized countries, and has been associated with an enormous weakening of forms of democratic politics across the industrialized world. If you like, you can think of that outsourcing that happened with manufacturing, largely beginning somewhere in the 1970s and accelerating after that. That outsourcing of production happened much earlier in the case of the outsourcing of energy. The outsourcing of energy production, meaning the prime source of energy for industrialized countries moving from places close to where, close to home, to places overseas, happened beginning in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s rather than the 70s, 80s. And there was an initial way in which the availability of oil as this alternative source of energy could be used to actually de-democratize weakened forms of democratic politics in the industrialized countries. And one can actually trace that in the archives of the period. So, for example, in the period after World War II, where there's a great resurgence of political activism by the left once the war ends, US organizers of the rebuilding of Europe through the Marshall Plan argue for using Marshall Plan funds, the aid for the reconstruction of Europe, not spending it in Europe, but actually to spend it in the Middle East in order to develop oil industries in the Middle East. And the specific argument they make is this is how we will defeat the left in Europe. Because the left is the coal mines. And the problems of Europe are the power of the left and the kinds of political demands they're making in the post-war period for collective ownership of industry, for a different position of workers in relationship to the management of industry and so on. Exactly the same story in the US. Wave of strikes in 48, 49, well, beginning actually right in 45 and then starting in 48 and 49, in coal, in other industries. The same decision is taken. You'll often hear it said in these debates about American energy independence that America became a net importer of oil as long ago as 1948. There's a specific reason. There was a wave of strikes, and on the railways and many other uses, people switched from coal to oil specifically as a way of defeating that post-war labor activism in the West. So this is not, this history of oil is not just a history of democratic, of obstacles to forms of democratic collective life in the Middle East, but that is directly tied. The history of democracy in the Middle East is directly tied into the history of democracy in the US and the history of democracy in parts of Western Europe. These are not different trajectories or different stories, they're parts of the same one. There is another part to thinking about this history. I mentioned this sort of much more flexible nature of oil production in the sense that it can be carried across oceans, it can be moved anywhere on the globe because it's relatively light and cheap to transport. And that this is realized and this is developed almost from the beginning of the 20th century onwards as the first oil tankers are built and the first pipelines get constructed and so on. That was, as I've already said, weakened the situation for those involved in the production of energy, but it was also an enormous threat to those trying to make large amounts of money out of the production of oil, the oil companies, because those enormous amounts of money could be made by the same sort of principles as the ones that the workers were attempting to use, namely by forms of sabotage, if you like. If you can limit the production of oil, if you can prevent the production of excess energy from their point of view, you can keep the price up. And that had been a principle in energy production ever since these carbon fuels came into being. Coal producers in Newcastle in the 14th century had cartel arrangements to limit the production of the amount of coal. But when you were doing it with coal, you only had to do it in your own region. Once energy can be moved around the world, if you're going to organize a system to limit, to sort of sabotage, in corporate terms, the potential production of energy in order to generate the highest possible profits by keeping it scarce, you've actually got to organize that system of corporate sabotage on a global scale. People think of the multinational oil company, this bizarre corporate form that emerges in the 20th century, as just sort of the natural tendency of corporations to get bigger and bigger. I don't think that's right. I think there's a specific form of industrial organization required in order to put in place control over production on a global scale, so that you could limit the flow of energy and keep profits high. So you want to think of a kind of certain vulnerability of the oil company, of the large multinational oil company, even at the beginning of the 20th century, always vulnerable to the production of oil somewhere else, arriving more cheaply and undercutting the system of supply and profits that's been put in place. And the whole history of oil, through at least the first 2/3 of the 20th century, is how this system of corporate control of oil can continually fight against the problem that there might be too much of it. How do you turn a source of energy that is enormously abundant into something that is continually limited and restricted in supply? So that, of course, affects the politics and the democratic politics of oil in another way, because the kinds of political power needed to exercise that global corporate sabotage on behalf of oil companies to prevent the production of more oil in places like Iraq, Iran, and other sites where local national governments wanted to increase production, was a particular form of international politics that emerges initially in the interwar period and then after World War II. I've now told you about chapter 1. More or less. But much of the argument in the book is in chapter 1, but some of this needs unfolding in much more detail in subsequent chapters, because you've sort of got to rewrite the history of the Middle East once you see it in these kinds of terms. So let me just jump ahead in the story to the moment that everybody knows and thinks of as an important turning point in the history of oil, in the history of energy politics, which is the 73-74 oil crisis. To make sense of that, one's got to make sense of something else first. Sorry, let me keep that in mind, but let me throw in a chapter that comes before that chapter and just briefly summarize another part of the argument. So the oil companies are facing this problem of trying to keep oil scarce enough to be able to generate very enormous profits off its relative scarcity. But that's not the only thing one can do. One can also try and improve the situation from the oil company's point of view, not only on the production side, but on the consumption side. And you see, beginning again in the 1930s, but accelerating after World War II, oil companies becoming increasingly concerned with finding ways to endlessly increase dependence on oil, dependence on this carbon energy, as a way of dealing from the other side with this threat of abundance of oil when you want to keep it somewhat scarce. So they get enormously involved in promoting automobile culture, the gas station, the tourist map, the tourist guide, a whole world, in fact, of dependence on the automobile, the building of suburbia, the buying up of public transport in cities and putting it out of business so that people would become dependent on cars. A whole series of strategies through the course of the 50s and 60s by which these enormously carbon-heavy forms of social life are constructed, not only by oil companies, but they have a very, very strong interest and role in creating these forms of collective life that will continually increase the demand for oil. There's another aspect that the book, of this story that the book goes into, because if one wants to do that, if one wants to create these enormously carbon-heavy forms of life, one's got to overcome a problem that preoccupied people in the 1930s. And it's going to come back later on. And that's the problem of a kind of limit to material resources. By the 1920s, 1930s, it seemed that the possibilities of the growth in forms of productive life and in forms of all the ways in which material expansion had happened so visibly over the last century and a half seemed to be coming to an end. I mean, the first was colonialism, whether European colonialism or the continental expansion of the US. That, of course, had already reached its limit, it seemed, by the time of the First World War. Population growth was leveling off. The growth of cities seemed to be slowing down. All the ways in which the growth of material life depended on the growth of forms of countable material objects, people, areas of territory, size of cities, all seem to be reaching some kind of plateau. And there was a widespread assumption by the 30s, and especially in the wake of the Depression, that one had reached that plateau, and now it was just a question of maintaining some sort of balance going forward in terms of the availability of resources and the ups and downs of what was called the business cycle. After World War II, it becomes possible to completely transform that and to overcome that sort of sense of material limits through a particular process of what one could think of as dematerialization, of organizing one's sort of sense of the future and of future expansion or growth that doesn't have to be measured in simple sort of physical or spatial or other material terms. You no longer have to think of it in terms of colonial expansion or the growth of population. And the critical thing here is the invention, somewhere around 1947, of something called the economy. People will tell you that Adam Smith, 150 years before, had written about something called the economy. And if not Adam Smith, you could trace it back to Aristotle. But the fact is that before the 1940s, no economist talked about or believed in the existence of something called the economy. By the interwar period, they're casting around for certain terms, and they're talking about things like the economic system in its totality. But the term the economy, as we know it and use it, came to know it, it comes into being in some uses in the late 30s, but is widely circulated after the Second World War in the late 40s and 50s. And it becomes the object of collective political life. Life in advanced industrialized countries is organized around the work that has to be done, the sacrifices that have to be made to maintain the growth of this new, not exactly physical object, because what is the economy? It's the movement of funds on the model of the way funds move within a firm through the national space. And in fact, the first word for it used by the US Council of Economic Advisors when they begin publishing statistical reports on this in a regular fashion in the 1940s. They just call it the nation's economic budget, because they don't have the word the economy. And they're just figuring out how to count this thing that's going to come to be called GNP or GDP, and all the forms of measurement that are going to put in place this object called the economy. That can now be what collective life is about, and whose growth becomes the main object of politics in the post-war period. Now this solves a huge problem, because the nice thing about the economy, because it's this dematerialized thing that is based on circulations of funds through accounts, is that it seems to have no limit to its growth. The old sense that there must be some physical limit to how much space there is and how much agricultural land there is and how much population there is, all gone, because you're now trying to grow this new thing called the economy, and it can do it without limit, potentially. You can organize all of collective life around the limitless expansion of this new object. One of the ways the book then tries to make sense of the 73 oil crisis is in relation to that history it's told in a couple of chapters that I've had to summarize very briefly about the organization of politics around a new kind of representation of collective life in terms of these new possibilities of economic calculation. And all that is in all kinds of ways, which I don't think I do justice to in the book, is thrown into disarray in a series of ways in the 1960s, but is sort of captured in a crisis of 73, 74, which is still thought of as the oil crisis, even though oil is only one small part of it. It's a crisis of the US dollar that's been developing since the late 60s, that's represented in terms of that happens in terms of the US going off the gold standard, it's called, an entire financial system that has been built in many significant ways on oil, which represents 50% of world trade, then going forward, goes through a transformation, a crisis, if you like, in the mid-70s, puts in place, and out of that emerges, if you like, a new kind of political order, which many people have spent given a lot of thought to understanding. The rise of neoliberalism would be one way of thinking about what happens after the mid-70s. The processes of deindustrialization would be another way, but there's a history of oil that's a very important part of that. I think, because I don't want to go on more than a couple more minutes, another way that I think is enormously helpful for thinking about that relationship between finance, between oil, and forms of productive life that I've been talking about is what takes over as in the forms of productive life in the wake of this transformation in the mid-70s. And some of the work of social theory and that of a number of colleagues, particularly from Italy, that Alberto has been quite influential in bringing to our attention, I think provides very useful ways of thinking about the kinds of transformations that take place, and that I've tried in the book to tie in a little bit to this kind of history of energy and forms of carbon democracy. So that if, to put the story in very stark terms, if that sort of vulnerability to democratic politics in the early part of the 20th century is based, of course, on forms of collective life that are organized around people involved in manufacturing processes that are enormously dependent on a single source of energy. That system continues, of course, as we move from the coal age to the oil age after World War II, and the manufacturing base vastly expands. The vulnerability is a little less because, in the ways I've talked about, with the switch from coal to oil, particular vulnerability to the general strike. But there's still the more general vulnerability of those who want to find ways of turning the capital they have into increased forms of wealth. That they still have to put it through this rather awkward business of manufacturing in order to bring back a larger return. And that continues to give possibilities for those who are involved in manufacturing processes on the other side to put in place a series of claims, a series of political demands whose power, whose force is based on the ability to disrupt the process through which that capital has to go in order to grow. You know, that's part of what's changing with this change in energy systems and also change in financial systems. And one of the ways to think about the switch between that period through the first 2/3 of the 20th century to the one we move in the last third of the 20th century is that instead of capital having to put large numbers of people to work as producers of material goods, it puts them to work as debtors in the system of credit. The enormous growth of, first of all, credit card debt in the 1980s, and then of household debt, of second mortgages, so that as the place of manufacturing wealth and manufacturing labor decreases and decreases in most advanced industrialized countries, more and more capital is reproducing itself through forms of finance that are not just happening on some other plane, but are happening through people's lives, but the lives of people who can only maintain standards of living after the oil crisis of the 1970s, which provides a convenient blame the problems. They can only maintain standards of living through ever-increasing levels of household debt, which, you know, they go from what basically zero in 1950, average U.S. household debt. European figures are very the same. not average, these are total US household debt reaches $1 trillion by the 1970s. By 2001, it's reached $7.5 trillion. And between 2001 and 2008, it doubles from 7.5 trillion to 14 trillion. And it's quite astonishing period of people being transformed into a new form of labor, the labor of paying off the fees and the other forms of debt for that are developed through the techniques of credit card scoring, through the new forms of transforming people's houses into forms of collateral and so on. And I mention that partly because I think it may connect with some of the things that Alberto will go on to talk about, but because I think it's important in ways I won't explain now, but perhaps we can talk about in the discussion. I think it's still very connected into sources of energy, to flows of energy, to possibilities of interrupting and making money out of forces of energy. And that even goes forward today into the sort of the phenomenon of fracking and the forms of finance and credit that are endlessly finding these new ways to speculate and reproduce themselves, which is what this current energy boom in the US is very much connected with. And that in thinking about contemporary forms of carbon democracy and contemporary possibilities for more democratic forms of political life and political practice, it seems to me continues to be important to tie together these questions of energy, of finance, of the economic, and of the forms of labor connected with them. Thanks very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity to speak here with Tim. And I'll try, in a sense, to discuss here the way in which that imaginary and that practice of interruption and sabotage that Tim has so usefully linked to the history and the fate of carbon democracy, the way that imaginary plays out today, and what might be some of the limitations, but also some of the potentials of thinking politics, or politics of circulation, which is also a politics of interruption. And as I'm rather viciously jet-lagged, I will read rather than improvise, which could lead to entirely nonsensical sentences and digressions. So in any instance, the allegorical value of this image might become clear later on, but we can return to it. I'd like to begin, first of all, by with a quote, a characteristically incisive and evocative quote from Alan Sekula, whose work on the political and economic aesthetics of the sea has been an abiding inspiration for myself as well as for many others, I think, for thinking about the politics of circulation today. And for thinking about that politics against the grain of ideologies or imaginaries of flow and immateriality that often impede critical cognition about our present. And in an essay from 2002, Sekula wrote the following: "In an age that denies the very existence of society, to insist on the scandal of the world's increasingly grotesque connectedness, the hidden, merciless grinding away beneath the slick, superficial liquidity of markets, is akin to putting oneself in the position of the ocean swimmer, timing one's strokes to the swell, turning one's submerged ear with every breath to the deep rumble of stones rolling on the bottom far below. To insist on the social is simply to practice purposeful immersion." Incidentally, that picture of, you'll see a few more of this container disaster comes from a very bizarre site. It's a kind of site where actuarial scientists and insurance brokers for the container industry sort of swap all of these kind of disaster porn container images in any case. So in this talk, I would like to revisit, meaning both to expand and to revise, some arguments about the current political significance of logistics that I rehearsed a couple of years ago in a brief article for Mute magazine entitled Logistics in Opposition. In that article, I tried to identify, picking up on one of the motifs of the very well-known, especially after Glenn Beck got his hands on it, book, The Coming Insurrection by the Invisible Committee. I tried to identify how widespread preoccupation amongst radical thinkers with events, ruptures, the census, and so on, was being both concretized and in some ways surpassed by what we could call a sort of spontaneous philosophy of interruption, or even of sabotage, which saw disruptive actions at the nodes and terminals of circulation as overtaking workers' actions at the point of production. And of course, as Tim has already discussed, of course, that point of production in the case of coal-based economies was not, in any case, in any instance, easily distinguishable from the point of circulation. But I think there is an important shift in imaginary, in a sense, at least political imaginary, from the factory to logistics, transport, circulation, and so on, as a political focus. Though I won't discuss it here, parenthetically, I think there is much critical reflection also to be drawn from the way in which the logistics of perception, as well as the perceptions of logistics, have been explored in the contemporary arts. I'm thinking here of Sekula's work on the instrumental image, on Harun Faraki's reflections on what he called the operational image, or, in a more popular vein, that whole poetics of containerization that seems to obsess contemporary narratives of capitalism, from The Wire to William Gibson's Spook Country and infinite other texts, which with Jeff Kinkov tried to deal with in this book called Cartographies of the Absolute, but I'll leave that aside. Now, the crux of the kind of political imaginary that I was trying to deal with and in some sense analyze and criticize in that piece of Mute comes across quite clearly in this quote, again from the book The Coming Insurrection, where the authors write, "The technical infrastructure of the metropolis is vulnerable. Its flows are not merely for the transportation of people and commodities. Information and energy circulate by way of wire networks, fibers, and channels, which it is possible to attack. To sabotage the social machine with some consequence today means reconquering and reinventing the means of interrupting its networks. How could a TGV line or an electrical network be rendered useless?" Of course, as an aside, that line about the TGV line was the reason why people, allegedly by the French criminal state apparatus, French criminologists working for the French state, led to them famously to engage in these raids against this commune in the village of Tabnak with an incredibly elaborate prosecution of dozens of activists on the basis of these sabotage actions that had indeed been taken against the TGV lines. As suggested by many of the militant reflections that accompanied the November 2011 shutdown of the port of Oakland, this could be framed, this question of interruption could be framed as an epochal shift in anti-capitalist actions from the strike to the blockade, as well as from workers' demands focused on their own workplaces and especially in control of their own workplaces. This question of control I'm trying to return to, to a less regimented convergence of what, in one of the comments by people linked to the shutdown of the Port of Oakland, they call an extrinsic proletariat, which I think is a kind of intriguing term. That is to say, in fact, precarious, dispossessed, indebted, unemployed people who, whilst proletarians were not in any way trying to gain control over their workplace. In fact, the Port of Oakland shutdown was in some ways coordinated with union action, but it wasn't a union operation, and the people involved were not trying to blockade or interrupt or take control over their own workplace. And I think this is something we're thinking about and returning to as a shift in the imaginary of what interruption might mean and what links it has to broader ideas of democratic or popular control. If capital in motion is, as I think both Marxist and capitalist managers generally concur, if capital no longer in motion is no longer capital, then its political immobilization, however fleeting, lends an impact otherwise absent, it seems, from defensive anti-austerity politics. And I think this was part of the attraction for many people of the shift from the idea of Occupy as a sort of prefigurative space for some kind of radical democratic politics to an actual action of interruption or of a break in the flows of capital. Motion and mobility, or rather mobilization, are polemical targets of the Invisible Committee's jeremiads against the depoliticizing despotism of the metropolis. And their wager, which is a wager common to other strands in contemporary radical and insurrectionary thought, is that the interruption of the spectacular regime of commodity flows may serve as a catalyst for the forging of antagonistic collectivities and forms of life. In fact, a kind of recasting of the political form of the commune, which traced its arc from the beginning of the Age of Empire to the present, through the transfiguration of the social space and political temporalities of cities such as Paris, Barcelona, Shanghai, Guangzhou, and so on, mutating along with economic conjunctures and ideas of politics. And I think it'd be interesting also to try to think the ways in which the shifts in ideas of interruption and antagonism and sabotage have also gone along with shifts in the ideas of what political collectivity might mean. In that original article, I suggested that the spatio-temporal imaginary at work here is not, in a sense, one of revolution, but more properly one of revolt. But that this is a different kind of revolt, one aimed not even so much at the urbanization of capital per se, but at the all-encompassing integration of production, circulation, and distribution. In logistical systems to which the supremacy of constant capital prophesied by Marx writes itself on the surface of the earth, in forms, in a sense, both titanic or vast and capillary or ubiquitous. This was, in a sense, the spatio-energetic complex that Lewis Mumford identified when he argued that, as he put it, processing had become the chief form of metropolitan control. And I think in a lot of these writings, like in the writings of the Invisible Committee, logistics stands in a sense, for this complete meshing or integration of political and state power, capital circulation, and security. Yet these apparatuses of accumulation and control, born to break the bargaining power of transport workers and to intensify profits by annihilating space and depressing wages, have also given rise to what the Italian workers theorist and actually logistics consultant, which is important, Sergio Bologna, has called the multitude of globalization. This is what happens when you can no longer get a post working in Italian universities. You can been run out of them due to your seemingly insurrectionary activities. That one of the forms of intellectual work, or indeed, so to speak, of material labor available to you, is that of working as a logistics consultant, which Bologna does in a very interesting way, which in a sense straddles his more radical writings. In any case, Bologna has spoken of what he calls, in a sense, he's spoken about this against a more ethereal understanding of what the multitude might be. He's spoken of a multitude of globalization, that is, of all of those who work across supply chains in the manual and intellectual labor that makes highly complex, integrated transnational systems of warehousing, transport, and control possible. And indeed, it is members of this so-called multitude, clerical workers at the port of Long Beach, crane operators in the Hong Kong container port, or distribution center workers for Walmart, or even air traffic controllers in Spain, in one of the more curious cases here, that have led some to see in these recent, and in some cases, relatively successful struggles, such as the one in Long Beach, not so much a secular vanishing, but a shift in the loci of class struggle, and perhaps, in a sense, via logistics rather than the question of coal and those energy flows per se, revitalization of certain forms of union organizing and antagonism. Beyond the notion shared by both the pro and anti-union left, so to speak, that attention to logistics lays bare some of capital's nerve centers, be they levers for political pressure or sites of antagonism, I also wanted to speculate in that article about a trend in some recent radical or anti-capitalist thinking to consider the logistical revolution as an important site for thinking the possible reconfiguration or refunctioning of capitalist social relations of production, towards imagining and practicing non-capitalist uses of quintessential instruments of contemporary accumulation. As some people have asked, can the speed, standardization, and automation of the container port or the capacities of Walmart distribution chains be regarded as possible material bases or fulcrums or affordances for alternative antagonistic organizations of production, circulation, and distribution? Now, this article was the object of a very interesting and rather trenchant, rather comradely critique in an article coming out in the journal Endnotes by Jasper Burns. The article is called Logistics, Counter-Logistics, and the Communist Prospect. And it raises some critical questions about that original piece that I think might be useful here to clarify at least some points regarding what I have called the politics of circulation. In particular, the article takes me to task as a representative of what Burns calls the reconfiguration thesis. It's always nice to have your thoughts nicely fixed in a thesis. Kind of 3,000 word piece written fairly sleepless night, so having a thesis is a commendable thing to come out of it. By reconfiguration thesis, he essentially means the notion that anti-capitalist politics should, the notion which he ascribes to me, that anti-capitalist politics should move beyond a mere negation or interruption of capitalist relations and orient itself towards thinking through what could be redeployed or refunctioned in the vast and vastly complex systems of dead labor that capital accumulation has thrown up. Systems of which logistics is both an emblem and a crucial element. Burns' text, I think, is one of the more interesting texts to come out as a reflection of not just the Occupy moment, but in particular what happened in the port of Oakland. So whenever it comes out, which I hope is soon, I recommend you look at it. But for the time being, I wanted to just simply respond to a few points to clarify, as I said, some of the coordinates of what I'm talking about in terms of the politics of circulation. In his piece, Burns suggests that, along with other people who I referred to, including Mike Davis in a very interesting piece in the New Left Review called Building the Arc, and Fred Jameson in his Valences of the Dialectic, he argued that I hold to the position that, I quote, all existing means of production must have some use beyond capital, and that all technological innovation must have, almost categorically, a progressive dimension which is recoupable through a process of determinate negation. And in some sense, the idea, I suppose, of his critique is that this is just a repetition with reference to logistics to a fairly traditional Marxist or socialist or Marxist-Leninist way of considering technology is in some sense a kind of blank progressive content that could be simply taken over and just used for egalitarian or emancipatory ends. Now, though I was purposely bending the stick against what I think is a kind of romanticism of communitarian sabotage which is present in the coming insurrection, so in that sense the critique is partly warranted, I would stress that any so-called reconfiguration by necessity concerns evaluating both practically and theoretically, as I put it in the article already, what aspects of contemporary capitalism could be refunctioned. That is to say, this implies that some, many, perhaps even most, I don't think anyone could decide the ratio a priori, of these aspects or devices or functions or relations could not have any future in a society not primarily organized around the accumulation of capital, and I'll get to that in a moment. In this regard, I think it's evident that thinking logistics in the direction of thinking about post-capitalist futures or transitions out of capitalism and so on involves reflecting on how much of the gigantism, as some people have put it, of the contemporary logistical complex is unthinkable outside of capital's irrational rationalities. As Bologna himself has pointed out in some of these kind of insider interventions in the sort of specialist logistics press, he's written about the problem of Italian ports. And one of the things that's happening in Italy is that there's a sort of speculative craze, basically, to build scores of these deep container ports. Present, it's Gioia Tauro and Genova and Naples are the ones that get most of the traffic, but various local authorities port authorities are vying with each other to build these titanic ports, many of which with the aim to be able to welcome these increasingly, the Kantian term, mathematically sublime container ships that are being produced in Korea. Now, as Bologna points out, the vast majority of containers traveling east from Europe are full of, as he puts it in quite colorful language in this logistics review, logistics journal, they are full of shit and air. That is to say, waste products from Europe and emptiness. A vast percentage of the boxes that go back are empty. And the craze for supercontainers, as well as for the building of countless deep ports, is comprehensible only in the context of the financialization of maritime assets and the correlated competition between different local authorities for subsidies and for capital. That is to say, so to speak, the use value of these ports considered outside of their financial or speculative one is dubious at best. So speaking, as I did, of potentially reconfigurable devices and relations is, I hope, compatible with a practical evaluation of what, where, and how any reconfiguration could occur. And I think for those interested in previous examples, there's some very interesting work on the question of refunctioning capitalist technologies that was brought forward in the 1970s in the attempt at self-management of the Lucas Aerospace firm in the United Kingdom, which is something that in very nice Haran Faraki film, as you see it, is dealt with at some length. Burns also suggests that, together with the relative evanescence of an organized working class at the hinges of circulation, the specific capitalist function of logistics means that it cannot be approached by analogy with a factory, traditionally envisaged by the left as a site of workers' reappropriation and control. Now that logistics has been driven globally by labor arbitrage and class struggle from above is certainly true, easily recorded, but I'm skeptical about some of the conclusions that Burns draws from this fact. Above all, he seems to take for granted that logistics has made possible a kind of linear race to the bottom in wages and working conditions. Now, the conditions here are hardly rosy. If we view the logistical revolution, say from Shenzhen and not from Long Beach, the bargaining power as well as the wages of sectors of Chinese workers have indeed risen, if in a very contradictory and problematic way. And the complexities of the international division of labor and possibilities of class struggle involved therein are not comprehensible, in my view, through this axis of viewing logistics as simply a depreciation of wages in a very binary relationship between a deindustrialized West and an industrialized East. The passage from craft, we should remember that the passage from craft to industrial assembly line production was also viewed as a devastation of the workplace and associational bargaining power of workers, but it turned out not to be such a univocal process, and I don't see how the focus on logistics could be simply seen as simply as a devastation of the power of the contemporary working class. In sum, I don't see logistics, which is nowadays in any case only analytically and not actually separable from the production process, as somehow lacking all of the refunctionable potentialities of the factory that the left had traditionally given it. Indeed, we could see logistics as a crucial component of the materialization of that old Italian workers' thesis, that of the social factor. As a complex material and social relation of circulation and exploitation, logistics does not seem to me that logistics is more constitutively hostile to workers' needs than the factory. That, it seems to me, would be a kind of technological determinism. Though I certainly think that it poses formidable problems for political strategy and thinking of transitions out of capitalism, as well as in a much more modest vein, to think a form of solidarity between workers across the division of labor that rules over these supply chains. Incidentally, we should also not forget, though most Marxists do, that as he noted in his rather neglected reflections in Volume 2 of Capital, that transport itself was viewed by Marx as a domain of production and of indeed productive labor. It is generally kind of taken for granted that for Marx, productive labor has this purely sort of factory-based industrial form. But he's very clear in Volume 2 that the transport industry is itself a domain of production, in which, and I think this formulation is quite an interesting one, in which the commodity is not an object, but, as he puts it, the change of place itself. And I think would be an interesting project to think more systematically through this idea. Now Burns, who nicely presents logistics not only as capital's art of war, as he puts it, but as its own solution to what Fred Jameson had called the problem of cognitive mapping, rejects the idea that some kind of counter-logistics, or more bluntly the collective planning of circulation, could throw up such an alternative map of our present. For him, as he writes, although it's behind me, because of the uneven distribution of productive means and capitals, not to mention the tendency for geographical specialization, the concentration of certain lines in certain areas, the system is not scalable in any way but up. It does not permit partitioning by continent, hemisphere, zone, or nation. It must be managed as a totality or not at all. Therefore, nearly all proponents of the reconfiguration thesis, among which I guess I'm counted, assume high volume and hyper-global distribution in their socialist or communist systems, even if the usefulness of such distributions beyond production for profit remain unclear. Now, the idea that the fundamental opacity of logistics to the individual worker, as Sekula nicely noted, the boxes are kind of container boxes that are kind of coffins of living labor power. This fundamental opacity prevents an emancipatory, the idea that this fundamental opacity prevents an emancipatory refunctioning of the system rests, I think, on a false premise. And the premise is that the mappability of capitalism is a primarily individual question. Short of the unviable idea that a post-capitalist society must be local and that its politics need involve the transparency of the small community or commune, I think the world market remains in however arduous a way a presupposition of any attempt to think through post-capitalist futures. After all, most things of worth and interest are beyond the cognizability of single individuals, be they scientific developments, cultural traditions, technological systems, or what have you. But I think this only poses a political problem as such if we think disalienation is a matter of personalizing collective and economic life, of making us, in some sense, at home in the world. Personally, I don't see why this would either be emancipatory or attractive. And incidentally, I don't think that logistics itself, as Burns suggests, is a view from nowhere. It is, after all, as looking at any arguments about, especially about competition between different cities and states in terms of organizing logistical systems, or indeed looking at all of the extreme contradictions that they pose to state authorities in terms of maintaining flows for economic reasons and preventing them from reasons of security. Logistics is, after all, a deeply incoherent, in many ways, contradictory, conflicted, and competitive domain, and not at all this unified and integrated fantasy, which I think is the fantasy that certainly much of the ideology generated, this kind of ideology of seamless flow generated from within the logistical industry and the managerial literature is linked to it, promote, but I think it's very dangerous for, or at least very counterproductive for leftist or activist thinkers to accept this idea of seamless integration, which would then pose interruption or break as the only form of response. And incidentally, this kind of ideology of seamless flow is not so different from the, and links quite closely to the managerial ideology of seamless flow that we're already familiar from such systems as Toyotism in the 1980s and various systems of conceiving factory production in particular. The value dynamics and spaces of logistics are deeply contradictory, and in fact, to go back to the point of capitalist rather than worker sabotage, more powerfully gummed up for the time being by internal impasses and indeed by capitalist strategies than by conscious antagonistic political interventions. Now Burns, reflecting on the experience of Oakland, which I think in many ways he's right in seeing as a kind of high point, or at least an interesting moment of the Occupy movement, at least one that tried to transcend a certain fascination with the mere experience of democracy to rediscover forms of struggle adequate to the present. On that basis, Burns puts a lot of emphasis on the blockade, but here I have questions as to whether the role of the blockade as a tactic and strategy has been duly clarified. In particular, I think it's important to think through what the criteria of political efficacy, and the term efficacy is one that returns here, are in this instance. Presumably, they are not a matter, at least in his formulation, of workplace bargaining power. The kind of bargaining power recently seen in Long Beach or Hong Kong container ports, when that sadly, the rather surreal missed opportunity that was the Spanish air traffic controller strike a couple of years back. This is in fact a terrible lost opportunity. Air traffic controllers did not participate in the rather relatively ineffective general strike that Spain had on the basis of austerity policies, and then engaged in their own strike, which was organized in fact as a, somebody put it as a mass sickie. They all called it sick to work. About 90% of Spanish air traffic controllers leading, and this anticipates some of what I want to say in a moment about the logistical state, leading the Spanish state to call its first state of emergency since the fall of Franco. In some cases, actually, and this is telling about the imperative of movement and mobilization to the well-being of a modern state, in some cases even allegedly getting the air traffic controllers more or less to work at gunpoint. They were taken there by the military, and they were standing there with their machine guns as people worked. Part of the problem was that air traffic controllers had very high wages in Spain, in some cases, upwards of $150,000 a year or something along those lines, leading the level of solidarity from other workers suffering under austerity to be rather minimal. So it was a very strange, I was in Spain just by chance, and it was very strange to see these scenes of these revolts at airports because they'd done it on the long weekend, semi-religious moment of tourism, and many of the people in the airports were essentially trying to find these controllers in a kind of vigilante-ish mood. So it's a complete disaster as far as workers' politics goes, but I think perhaps an instructive one. But In that, in the case of the Long Beach or Hong Kong, or indeed even this strike, the role of the disruptive power of the interruption or blockade is fairly straightforward. It's a bargaining measure. It's a bargaining measure which in some cases was successful, in others wasn't, having to do with a particular capacity to monopolize, by workers to monopolize control of these choke points or levers. This is not in any straightforward way the case for the blockade of the port of Oakland in 2011, which was not workers' initiative. It was not bargaining for anything in particular. It was a response to the shutdown of Occupy by the Oakland authorities and police. So in one sense, it's a kind of undefined political form, and I think it would be interesting to think through what the efficacy of these blockades and interruptions that are not in the collective or democratic or syndical logic of disruptive power. Now, is power here measured principally by providing a kind of emblem, a point of political condensation for politics? So in a sense, the Port of Oakland stands in for these flows of capital over which we have little control and even less capacity to understand and cognize. Is it measured by the losses incurred by particular capitalists, particular firms, and so on? So often, as people used to measure the effect of strikes in terms of hours lost, profits lost, etc., is this one of the measures? Interestingly, in Spain, general strikes are measured by the use of electricity, very often in the media. So the success of the strike is kind of calculated in terms of drop in the use of the electricity grid by factories and so on. And there was a kind of interesting debate when the general strike took place in Spain, because of course that was a measure for a rather, so to speak, Fordist moment in what the strike meant. So you could have a massive general strike whose effect on electricity usage might not be in any way so straightforward. Further, what kind of political spaces and durable organization, in the widest sense of the term, can we see coalescing around the blockade as a form of contemporary struggle? Now, to give some more clarity to these questions, or to try to frame them, I want to actually make a kind of theoretical detour here and think more about what we might mean by circulation, because the one schema that I kind of want to move away from, and I think we already have in Tim's talk and obviously through his book as well, is moving through this very homogeneous idea of what the circulation of capital might mean, the very homogeneous idea of what flows of matter and energy might mean, as if we then could oppose interruption to some generic idea of capital and material flow. And so I think in that sense, thinking through what might be meant by circulation might be worth our while. Now, I think one of the problems, curiously, in what I call this kind of spontaneous philosophy of interruption, one of the problems with it is a kind of fetishism, in a sense, about technology and materials. That is to say, the idea that interrupting visible empirical flows of material might itself be sufficient as a political act, and I think an insufficient consciousness, perhaps, about the social forms and relations in which these technologies and materials are embedded. So in that sense, it seems to me that one of the pitfalls of what we could call an interruptive strain in the politics of circulation is the idea of seeing the blockage as a kind of material revelation, that we would block the flows of capital or block the flows of material, and suddenly almost we would have revealed to us our own reliance on infrastructure and matter and so on, that in itself would be a politicizing, both a cognitive and a politicizing moment. In this respect, I think some of the critiques that the geographer Stephen Graham has made regarding contemporary thinking about infrastructural disruptions are quite useful. And Graham in particular criticizes this idea that disruptions, whether accidental, natural, social, or otherwise, engage, to use Irving Goffman's term, in a front staging of the backstage, that somehow they reveal everything that we had previously ignored. Of course, there's partial truth in that, but I think Graham shows quite well, first of all, how this seemingly invisible and seamless backstage is the front stage for most of the world, which experiences infrastructure and energy and matter not at all as an invisible and transparent and efficacious relationship. But also that here there's again a danger of a sort of mirroring of state discourses and activist discourses. As Graham has pointed out very well, especially in writing about the war in Iraq, there's now a whole military doctrine about the primary form of military intervention being that of shutting cities down, shutting infrastructural systems down, basically arresting the reproduction of social life and all of its material and energetic affordances. And this is in fact something that's been put in practice in the occupation of Palestine and Iraq and so on and so forth. But I think while the immediate military expediency for agencies that indeed have no interest in necessarily kickstarting forms of social reproduction after they interrupt it, this is not an imaginary that's of much use, it seems to me, to leftist or emancipatory thinking as such. Now, I think one of the theoretical limits then of this philosophy of interruption, whether it is spontaneous or reflexive, that marks much contemporary radicalism, lies in its insufficient consideration of the polysemy, of the many meanings of circulation. In brief, I think that the political wishful thinking behind fetishizing the blockade is based on the notion that all varieties of circulation can be targeted at the choke points of logistics. Now, even if we remain only within the bounds of Marx's own writings about circulation, I think, and this is, I think, instructive, it is a term that can take an at times bewildering and slippering variety of meanings. It can denote flows of materials and resources, such as would exist in any mode of production. It can denote the sphere of exchange, that domain ruled over by freedom, equality, and Bentham, and from which most of our misprisions about liberalism are thought to derive. It can signify circulating as opposed to fixed capital, that is to say, the capital consumed in the process of production, be it raw materials or the exertion of living labor power. But it can also mean what Marx at certain points called capital of circulation, that capital which takes different guises in its travels through the market, leading to Marx's crucial reflections on what he called circulation time. And we can even think of circulation in keeping with the circuits in which Marx maps the formal metamorphoses of value, which are also the sites at the level of theory of capital's contradictions. Now, in this maze of interlocking forms, which obviously I can't explore here, what remains critical for us, I think, both theoretically and practically, is to reflect on the way in which it might allow us to prevent what, paraphrasing Whitehead, we could call the fallacy of misplaced materialism. The idea that, in fact, we know what matter or material and might be, socially speaking. In 1928, the brilliant Russian Marxist Isaac Ilyich Rubin pioneered the discussion of Marx as a thinker of social form. Rubin stressed how Marx's critique of classical political economy hinges on distinguishing, and this is how Rubin puts it, between material categories concerned with technical methods and instruments of labor, on the one hand, and social forms concerned with specifically capitalist relations on the other. According to Rubin's reading of Marx, the blind spot of political economy is precisely its inability to think why these particular value forms are generated in bourgeois society, and wrongly supposing that it is in trans-historical material categories, labor in general rather than labor power, exchange separate from capital, technology, that one can look for the clues to the structure and development of a mode of production. Marx's remonstrations against those political economists who, in Rubin's terms, cannot see the social forms that lie beneath the technical functions in material production are many. This was the impetus behind a lot of statements in which Marx is extremely anti-materialist, at least if we have a very limited understanding of what materialism might mean. As he famously puts it in Volume 1 of Capital, the value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters into its composition. Now, this critique of materialism is also a key postulate in Volume 2, which is, I think, the place in Marx where to think not just about circulation, but also about transport, and also to begin to think about the link between credit and finance and the building of the material spaces for capital accumulation. And it is in Volume 2 where Marx makes some of his more interesting attacks against those economists who think of matter and materialism in this naive manner. This is what he says, and I think it's interesting for thinking these more political issues about circulation. This is in the critique of liberal political economists. Firstly, certain properties that characterize the means of labor materially are made into direct properties of fixed capital. For example, physical immobility, such as that of a house. But it is always easy to show that other means of labor, which are also as such fixed capital, ships for example, have the opposite property, i.e. physical mobility. Alternatively, the formal economic characteristic that arises from the circulation of value is confused with a concrete property, as if things which are never capital at all in themselves could already in themselves and by nature be capital in a definite form, fixed or circulating. And I think this kind of methodological proviso is quite interesting. If we think of the way, for instance, people remain attached to the notion that a commodity has to be a visible, fixed material product, part of the reason why there's such a difficulty in thinking of transport as productive labor, but also in the way in which many of the dynamics, many of the relationships between matter and, for instance, financial abstraction in the contemporary economy are rendered opaque by not thinking through these categorical problems. So, for instance, take those ships, those new mega containers that currently are lumbering their way onto the market and demanding huge outlays of public finances on the construction of corresponding ports. These may be better understood in certain cases in their existence, in their form as financial assets, than in their nature as physical capital or commodities. What happens then if we consider the question of circulation less literally? What would it mean to struggle not simply against material flows and but against the social forms that channel them? Can we think of different types of struggle in terms of how they map onto the various meanings of circulation mentioned above? On the one level, the notion that capital, not emotion, is no longer capital, or as Marx rather stunningly puts it, that continuity is a productive force of labor, has important political resonances. Though these might be more evident in the creeping devastation of deindustrialization than in the blockade itself. On the other, the nature of capital is such that the arms race to lessen circulation times by deploying vast logistical apparatuses goes hand in hand with the hypertrophy of constant capital, the hypertrophy of the material means of capital accumulation. And there's a nice and more, in a sense, aesthetic and poetic description of this phenomenon in Jameson's recent book about Volume 1 of Capital. He writes, at the same time, the dead labor embodied in machinery suddenly swells to inhuman proportions. It is as though the reservoir, or as Heidegger would call it, the standing reserve of past or dead labor, was immensely increased and offered ever huge storage facilities for these quantities of dead hours. which the merely life-size human machine minder is nonetheless to bring back to life on the pattern of the older production. The quantities of the past have been rendered invisible by the production process, and yet they now surround the worker in a proportion hitherto unthinkable. The kind of suggestion here that crushing or alienation of variable capital or living labor by constant capital is now taking an even more extreme form. I recently tried to argue in another piece for Mute how in the real estate politics and energetic difficulties that plague the seemingly ethereal and abstract domain of high-frequency trading, we could also witness such a revenge of matter and space upon abstraction. A revenge we can only understand, I think, in terms of certain social forms that are specifically capitalist. In an economic field whose drive to instantaneousness, that of finance, seems to obliterate spatial difference, this corroborates, I think, in the financial arena, a famous observation from the Grundrisse. The more production comes to rest on exchange value, hence on exchange, the more important, and I think this is crucial, the more important do the physical conditions of exchange, the means of communication and transport, become for the cost of circulation. Capital by its nature drives beyond every spatial barrier. Thus, the creation of the physical conditions of exchange, of the means of communication and transport, the annihilation of space by time, becomes an extraordinary necessity for it. For the cost of financial circulation, physical conditions are paramount, as manifest right around the corner from here, or right across the water from here, in the fierce competition over co-located server space in New Jersey. This is the Mao Center, where much of the high-frequency co-location space is present, where, for instance, proximity to trading venues and access to data leads to an incredible inflation in the ground rents for areas that hitherto might have lain fallow, and in related phenomena like the rush to acquire and develop real estate for data centers. The monopolistic character of spatial competition, in which relative locational advantage translates into excess profits, dictates that the annihilation of space by time, and this is something that I think David Harvey has nicely pointed out, accentuates rather than undermines the significance of space. That the frictions and inertias of space can be overcome only through the production of space, of systems of communication and physical infrastructures embedded in the land. And I think the case of high-frequency trading is particularly instructive because, of course, all of the, in many sense, like with logistics, but more extremely, all of the boosterist press is about the instantaneity, about reaching peaks of immaterial acceleration and seamless accumulation of capital. Well, it turns out that the energy material demands are enormous, and the real estate politics at times perhaps even more significant than other forms of competition. And not to mention the geographical and environmental impact being considerable in order to lay, there's a nice piece by Donna McKenzie about this, in order to lay the cable shortening by, I think, a matter of milliseconds, the link between the Chicago and New York Stock Exchange, giant holes were drilled into the Allegheny Mountains in a way that makes space far more significant than it might have been for the telephone or earlier forms of digital communication. And just to conclude, I think the last thing that I wanted to bring up, and I'll only do this very briefly, is that attention, not just to the politics of circulation, but to the way in which the social forms that come along with the accumulation of capital affect the production of space, and especially affect this dynamic between fixity and mobility, and the way in which increasing mobility and acceleration demands increasing outlays into constant capital, increasing transformation of the built environment, and increasing and financialized significance of real estate and ground rent, that all of this also, of necessity, leads us to think about an element which is often absent from the discussion of this politics of blockade or interruption, that is the state. Recently, I came across some of the writings of course, the pioneering figure in thinking of the production of space, Henri Lefebvre, from the late 70s. And Lefebvre in the late 70s became persuaded of the increasing significance of logistics to the nature of production and to the role of the state as a producer of space. So much so that in ways that I think are, certainly from a more classically Marxist position, rather disputable, he decided, or he hypothesized that we were moving from a capitalist mode of production to what he called a state mode of production. I think this is very interesting because Lefebvre writes this in 1978, more or less in conjunction with what many people see as the inaugural moment in the emergence of neoliberalism, and of course a sort of widespread conviction in the fact that, widespread conviction amongst both promoters and adversaries of the new arrangement, that the state has been rolled back. And instead, what Lefebvre stresses is precisely that the new forms of state power and the new forms of capital accumulation put this question of the production of space and of logistics, that is to say, of the state's control over flows and stocks at the center. And one of the curious things that, two things that I simply wanted to mention that Lefebvre points out that are important. The first is how he defines this space, and he calls the space of the state mode of production a broken and homogeneous space. And I think this is something quite interesting. Rather than seeing it as a homogeneous space of flows, he sees it as a space that demands a kind of homogeneity. It has to be commensurable, it has to allow for oversight, but it also has this contradictory dynamic because it is a space of accumulation that is also a space of competition, a space that is broken and fragmentary. So then in that sense, the idea of seamless flow remains a fantasy of the state and of capital itself, but it's a fantasy that it itself is constantly undermining. It itself is constantly undermining because, of course, the one thing that it has to reproduce is not just its own existence, and it's not just the ability for capital to circulate and flow and metamorphose through its various forms, but it also has to reproduce the possibilities for extreme forms of competition, spatio-temporal fixes, the breaking up of space, and so on. And the second point that he raises, which is linked to this contradiction, is the idea that somehow this incipient state mode of production is also based on the attempt, or perhaps also the fantasy, to bring together political control, or the neutralization of political antagonism, and the flow and accumulation of capital. And that somehow he sees this in the late 70s as a kind of ideal horizon for the state, is that logistics comes to stand in for the possibility of neutralizing political antagonism, therefore controlling political agency, but also permitting the unremitting and constant flow and accumulation of capital. But I think what's important here, and that's the last thing that I wanted to mention, is that in Lefebvre's text, especially through the way that he understands this logistical space as an incredibly contradictory space, I think we can begin to have some of the tools that we can already draw from thinking about the contradictions between fixity and mobility that a spatial analysis of capitalism already brings out. Some of the tools for breaking out, perhaps, of this excessively limited vision of interruption or sabotage or the blockade as being the counterpart of a capital that we imagine as homogeneous, smoothly flowing, and in some sense monolithic. And that's partly important because, as I think Tim's comments about the sabotaging activities of firms and corporations themselves suggested that much of the interruptive and contradictory activities, of course, is not in any way antagonistic or explicitly political, but is part of the competitive and contradictory dynamics of the system itself, which I think is of political significance. So, thank you.
So we do have time for some questions if you would like to ask them. Feel free to raise your hand if you have something to ask. If you wouldn't mind raising your voice so we can hear you, yeah.
I'll shout. Well, I found it very interesting, and this gets to initial,
Yeah.
So your point to think about the materiality, the physicality of fossil fuels and forms of democracies brings forward. So the switch from coal to oil. And I'm wondering what you have to say about the switch to gas. And especially, and I'm thinking here about this newer projects that open up these imaginaries, to open up some corridors, to link Azerbaijan with Europe, to get off Russian dependency. And so I'm wondering what you would say to the vulnerability of gas, to the pipelines. Some are visible, some are not visible, some are beneath the earth, some are above. Some go through Turkey, Greece, but they also go through former communist countries such as Albania. And then they go underneath the Adriatic, and then they connect to Italy, and then they spread out to Western Europe. So is there any equality in terms of the vulnerability of gas? Is this something that is shaping very much the ways in which we think about the habits of fossil fuels? Or how does this connect to oil, for instance? Where it doesn't have to go and shift through.
Well, it's hard to say in general because gas is different in different places, and that indeed was part of the history of gas. Let me stay close to the microphone. Although, like oil, it moved in pipelines. Unlike oil, it didn't move across oceans. Of course, with the development of liquefying and transporting gas by tanker after it's been liquefied, in an attempt to overcome that, create something like a global market in gas, although that hasn't happened yet on a significant enough scale. So, there's a lot of quite specific politics of pipelines of gas in different regions, and it works in certain ways in the United States and other ways in the politics of gas pipelines in Europe and the forms of vulnerabilities of states. So it's very hard to think of something in general to say about that beyond the point, this specific point about the way it has a sort of historically had this kind of continental limit to the forms of transportation. Part of the history of these. Of these systems of pipelines is, of course, the increasing sophistication in which the attempts are made to overcome the forms of vulnerability that they represent, and that one sees in the proliferation of pipelines across the European continent and from Russia, the attempt to now build new pipelines that sort of circumvent Russian
to come around the south of Europe and to do the same with vast new pipelines as well, going under the Adriatic. I think it's difficult to, you know, there's one way of sort of talking about the materiality of these energy flows in which one can sort of, you know, if you tell me the type of energy and the type of mode of its transportation, I will tell you the politics that are possible and where the vulnerabilities are going to be. And in my own book, and I think this does relate to what Alberto's been saying, I think it's enormously important to think the specificity of each of those histories of energy flows, of pipelines, and think it through in those terms, which isn't a particularly satisfying answer to your question, but I don't think I can answer on the general level of gas pipelines sort of doing something politically that is specific to gas as a source of fuel.
I wanted to revisit a point Professor Mitchell had made regarding the championing of oil industry and infrastructure as a means to undermine the post-war left. I guess my question now refers to the Middle East, specifically with modern-day Egypt as kind of
Modern-day
Egypt as the circumstances there. Given the current political binary lies between some sort of Islamist narrative, whatever that word means, Islamist, that has become so intermeshed with neoliberal ideology, and on the other hand, a deep state kind of infrastructure / army that in and of itself is also born of neoliberalism. Has the left already lost in the Middle East, or is there a place for it in this geography between these two binaries?
It certainly lost this round, unfortunately. Though, you know, including in the curious way it split. You know, specific case of Egypt and the military takeover in July, with people who might have previously been identified with the left celebrating the not just celebrating the military takeover, but the use of violence against the Brotherhood. So that's one aspect of it. In terms of the larger sense that it's lost, I think that's the way it's feeling right now, definitely. It's a rather difficult moment compared to where things were 2 years ago, and I think it's important to learn from that and to think about what happened in those intervening two years. And I think one of the things was not thinking through and not relating to the problem of the military in the right kinds of ways.
First of all, I think both talks were excellent. If we have time, it'd be nice if the presenters could actually comment on each other's paper. I'd be really interested to hear that. But before that, I have a couple questions for Professor Mitchell. What would your comments be on the role of energy in 1968, where you're basically saying that we have the Marshall Plan that's weakening the left, and then we have this incredible upheaval 20 years later. So I want to hear your ideas on that. Also,
this guy knows more about 68 than I do, but
one more.
It's a bit of a mystery to me.
And one more quick comment, actually, a quick question. I'll be interested to hear what you think about the role of coal in China in the present day. And lastly, I've read your book, and I'm interested where the first bit you're saying ideas just don't really matter for the creation of the working class. But then later on in the book, ideas matter very much in the construction of the economy or the market and these other things. So like, what's the relationship between materialism and idealism in your narrative? That's...
Okay, so I'm gonna let Alberto talk about 68. After that, which well, why don't you go first?
about the role of energy.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this, one way that one could run this through France and Italy and so on is obviously at one remove, which is to think about the way in which certain modes of consumption and everyday life, which were clearly deeply embedded with the particular energetic economies that Tim was talking about, were part of what part of what the prelude or the lead up to 68 was. Now, that said, I mean, if you look across different countries, you have a very different configuration of the importance of labor, and I mean, at least in the Italian case, the importance of an automotive industry that was sort of at its peak, and there was, and Italy, of course, the thing to note is that 68 is not very significant as a year in Italy. The important year is 69, and 69 is really a year of the peak of struggle around Fiat in Turin, and that's also an interesting moment because it's a moment of very different composition of labor, because you have also a lot of young, or semi-skilled migrant workers, which are much more radicalized than the older workers in the automotive industry. And moreover, and this actually would be one of the most important places for workers' organization, especially for organization of people who were very close or integrated into what is referred to as operaismo, or workerism, so the intellectual tendency out of which Mario Tolonti and Antonio Negri in Bologna himself came out of. The most important place where they actually organized was the Porto Marghera petrochemical complex across from Venice. And a lot of that organization, on which they wrote, and recently there's been some interesting documentaries done, a lot of that organization, and I think this is a further element of interest, was around the question of pollution. And a lot of the workers themselves, some of the moments of taking over the factory were often moments of taking over the factory to regulate its degree, to obviously as a bargaining attempt to raise wages, often in a very radical way, with this very political demand to equalize wages across the factory. But it was also a matter of dealing with the extreme levels of pollution and toxicity that workers and everybody living in the area. And that's a very interesting place, because of course it brings up this question of the real contradiction of a local, radical workers and politically emancipatory movement whose livelihood depends on the very thing that's, going to give them cancer and is going to, give diseases to their children and so on, because that's where they're working. And so very interesting to see then how that becomes something that the workers themselves organize around. And even though, of course, the slogan of that period is this idea of, the refusal of labor, or the liberation from labor, nevertheless, it's still very much cited in the factory. So in the Italian case, that would be, at least for me, that would be, thank you for the question, because it's the first time I've thought about it in connection to Tim's work and to discussions, but that I think would be a very important place. And also to think, why is it that one of the more radical forms of political organizing in Italy had a foothold in that particular industry more than, say, in the car industry and so on? Because one of the things about operaismo at that moment was precisely this focus on the liberation from work, on not just the wage. So that's a kind of interesting aspect. It's a movement that's also beyond, it's still very much a workers' movement with all of those tactical elements it can have, but it's also a movement beyond negotiating over the wage. So it's not simply you interrupt work to raise your wage. It's a much more complex thing which has to do with the fact that they're working in a chemical plant.
That's fascinating. I just have this very passing reference in one of the chapters of Carbon Democracy to 68, but it links directly to this because it's one of the theorists of sort of 68 is French sociologist Serge Mallet, who earlier has published research based on fieldwork in a petrochemical complex, which he uses to argue, and maybe he's connected it to all this stuff outside Venice. I don't know. I mean, his petrochemical factory is outside Bordeaux on the Gironde, but he suggests that on the basis of this research, he spent 6 months working there in the petrochemical complex, that this whole history of sabotage is changing because in the old days sabotage was just coal miners and railway workers and so on, but now because the nature of industrial production is transformed into things like the processing of chemicals, workers are people wearing white coats and they are involved in the monitoring of things typified by these chemical processes, in which sabotage can now take place in very subtle ways that don't actually necessarily interrupt the total process. They affect it in other much more targeted, much more focused ways, so that you can carry out forms of worker sabotage while staying at work. You don't actually have to down tools, stop the railway. You carry them out at work, so you can build larger coalitions around labor activism because you don't have to be willing to sacrifice your pay to engage in forms of labor intervention. So there seems to be something about the petrochemical complex that both in France and Italy is inspiring people and suggesting alternative kinds of politics. And that particular refinery complex was built with Marshall Plan funds for the new Saudi oil that was the whole sort of post-war reorganizing of the energy system. So it's actually out of that process that I talk about in more detail in 48, 49, 50 that Mallet then finds the site in which to study 15 years later, the transformation, that he sees as important to the possibilities for worker politics. The question about suggesting for sort of earlier histories of forms of mass democracy, popular politics, that ideas don't matter. I mean, and yet I seem to imply that they do with the birth of the economy. I'd say, first of all, for the earlier period, I'm trying to get away from and show the weaknesses of the entire sort of apparatus of liberal democratic theory that was informing, among other things, debates about politics in the Middle East then and with the Arab Spring. But it's also very important to me in the work that I've done on the making of the economy as an object of politics in the post-war period, that this is not about the invention of an idea. Because what I've tried to locate it in is a whole set of very practical transformations in the way forms of collective life are organized. So in order to bring the economy into being, one of the things you have to do is set up entirely new forms of central banking, the creation of the Federal Reserve System in the case of the United States, introducing paper money as something that circulates on a daily basis in a way that it never did before the 1920s and 1930s, so that instead of people being largely based in local credit systems where you run out accounts for most of your purchases, you're actually using this thing called money. And it's the circulation of that money that can then be not just envisaged as the economy, as the new ways of calculating national income develop in the 20s and 30s, but you can actually calculate. You've got something material, some form of movement of this paper money that is markedly different from anything that existed before the First World War. That can be counted. And many other forms of
the rise of the national scale retail corporation that is involved in keeping accounts through branches that are spread throughout the country, so you can then produce national level data about sales, about consumption and so on, is a very important aspect of being able to count these units of consumption, where every household in the country is being configured as a unit whose interactions collectively are going into the production. The rise of the corporation is because the economy is basically configured as consisting of state, households, and this third thing called the firm or the corporation, that's come into being in a remarkably recent period. Again, in the case of the United States, around the beginning of the 20th century, the corporation means largely one thing. If you look at the New York Stock Exchange, there's 115 companies. 106 of them are railway companies, railroad companies. You go from there to 20 years later, when the corporation has become this ubiquitous business form, involved in forms of accounting, in forms of relationships to shareholders and so on, that has completely transformed the way in which all kinds of commercial life operates. So, to me, the economy isn't an idea. It's a remarkable set of transformations, mostly in the interwar period, that it gradually gathered together and produced these modes of what would give rise to these possibilities of producing forms of statistical work that can be then referred to and worked upon as the economy.
I have a question for each of you. Timothy, I have read Carbon Democracy, but I have read The Rule of Experts, and I'm interested in, and apologies if this is something you do in Carbon Democracy, but I'm interested in what you do in The Rule of Experts is take these, you're very interested in how concepts like modernity or the economy are reified, and how things like mosquitoes or anything else is objectified. And I think in that we get at the importance of how we relate to objects, things that we objectify. And I'm wondering if you can do that with coal and with gas and energy sources. I've done research in Australia on energy production and activism around that, and both with coal and with fracking. And I've gone to a lot of protests for each, and they both do quite similar things. Blockading at the sources of extraction or circulation, and big street protests and stuff. Now the fracking social movement is a lot more effective, and that is for many, many reasons. But one thing I've noticed is that the way that people talk about each of those two materials, and people always talk about coal as the object, but people never really talk about the gas. They're always talking about the process of fracking, and that's just one example, but I think there are a lot of different ways in which people relate to the object of gas and the object of coal and how they talk about them. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that. And Alberto, I just had a question. I'm really interested in the idea of this politics of interruption. And I can't remember whether it was Jasper Burns who was talking about the blockade in Oakland. And one thing I wonder about this politics of interruption is whether attention gets taken away from the process of social movement building and gets put on the kind of the final act of protest. So his analysis was talking a lot about the blockade at Oakland, but I feel like the kind of analysis of alliance building, so it's just the metaphor of interruption seems to maybe mischaracterize to me somehow a lot of what is actually going on in those, and I might be missing the point here, but I feel like the the importance of alliance building and other kinds of acts don't get talked about in these analyses.
Yeah,
I think one of the things I was trying to get at by thinking critically about the way the interruption of certain flows of capital and goods and so on has become an object of radical political thought and so on recently, is that somehow, and this relates, I think, to the point you've raised, that somehow there's a kind of simplicity. There's a sort of simplicity in the there's a complexity in the construction of the act of blockade. It's incredibly complicated, and in fact, it's not just a matter of alliance. It's obviously also a matter of dissensions and splits and different positions taken, because this, I'm sure the occupation of the port of Oakland was not by any means a unproblematic or unanimous political decision amongst the people organizing. But I think one of the problems for me in the way that certain notions of interruption, even more widely of dissensus event and so on, they've come to be seen as moments in which a certain antagonistic collectivity is kind of revealed. And I think there's a truth to that, and the truth is experienced by anyone who's stood in a picket line or whatever, or engaged in some of the forms of activism that you were talking about. There's definitely a form of political synthesis and collectivity that emerges from such acts. What I think is interesting, though, about these horizons now, which is very different than the discussion that we were having about the petrochemical complexes, or indeed about a tradition of workers' control, or even, and certainly about the fact that the kinds of interruption that took place in the various nodes of the political economy of coal in Europe and elsewhere were interruptions whose horizon was the appropriation and control of the very thing that was being interrupted. So there was a sense in which, and this is the peculiarly split position of workers in this case, because you're interrupting not only the source of your own wages, but you are also, if you're a worker in a broader socialist movement, etc., you're also engaging in an activity against forms of production and transport and circulation that you yourself imagine as being part of whatever alternative or future political organization or social organization you might be part of. Now that, and I think there's obvious reasons, many of which have to do with deindustrialization and with certain political defeats of the left and historical changes and so on, that mean that the link between interruption and control, or the link between interruption and or blockade or sabotage and appropriation, or the socialist uses of capitalist machinery or what have you, is one that's not at all present or transparent. So that means that a lot of weight is being put on the act of disruption itself, and the part of the problem of that is the form of collectivity that you can have around a purely disruptive act is a limited one. And this, in one way, gets back to the earlier question about the problems, the political problems, specifically political problems incurred by many of the revolutionary movements around the so-called Arab Spring, is that even though the taking of the square is not as such, it's not straightforwardly the same thing as a blockade or a sabotage, etc., but it is a form of collectivity which, complex in articulation and alliances and the way that it's built, nevertheless doesn't in any straightforward way have any of the capacities of social control that previous movements were claiming. That is to say that it doesn't translate, it's in some sense purely political. Of course it emerges out of society, it emerges out of incredibly complicated, long-term, painstaking, and by no means homogeneous forms of political organization that, have been dealt with at great length and with varying levels of success by different people writing about these moments. But it doesn't, curiously, it actually lacks lacks a kind of social and organizational complexity that previous movements, and certainly workers' movements, claim to them. Because workers' movements always presented themselves, for better and for worse, as, in a sense, societies in waiting. Or in fact, even in the case of certain workers' movements or self-management and control, as already having all of the capacities to organize an alternative situation, and the only problem was, removing or taking the command and control centers or what have you. And that's very different, and I think that also in part explains the depressing effect of seeing the construction of incredibly complex and forceful movements, which seem, I don't think it's the case that they do, but seem to not vanish without a trace, but at least to lose any of the power that they had accumulated before these really critical moments. And I think that, I think that's, and I don't think it's, I don't mean to say that because, just to fantasize that we could just return to some previous mode of organizing, but I do think it's a concrete problem. And that part of it has to do with the fact that these are struggles that are not taking place, in the case of the logistics issue and the blockade, they're not worker struggles, and the worker struggles that exist, even the ones that are impressive, like the recent Long Beach one and so on, are often incredibly defensive. I mean, there's not even like the remotest horizon of self-management control. They're just simply trying not to, outsource clerical jobs at, container terminals or whatever. So I think it's a real problem in that regard. But I think that split between disruption and control is an important one, because the other thing that disruption has done is, either the disruption is a matter of bargaining power and associative and collective workers' power, or it's disruption within an already existing democratic polity, where that disruption is a mass and sometimes symbolic demand for certain reforms. That's the other element, of course, of not just Occupy as a whole, but the Open moment, is that it's not really a demand, because there's no there's no plausible horizon of what you'd be demanding from whom, in the sense of a power dynamic whereby that would be. So I think that's something to think through. Like a really 20,000 people blocking, shutting down a container port is an incredibly impressive thing to build, and also an incredibly unlikely thing in many ways to happen within our current political imaginary. But it's also, in a sense, kind of strategically orphaned by certain social transformations that make its efficacy difficult to, because a massive disruptive act, when you have a power that responds to you, is one thing, because then it's a show of power, and then that's a kind of, but disruption without bargaining is a curious, mode, and I think that it's something that happens, that's not just happened in that case in Ontology, but I think it's a current problem of anti-systemic political organizing.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I'll just come back to Egypt again briefly. I certainly agree with what you have to say, that although there was a lot of sort of careful organizing on the ground to make the initial seizure of Tahrir effective, as opposed to many earlier attempts to organize political protest in the center of the city over at least the previous decade and going back longer. One of the things that I've realized, and certainly people I've been in touch with, is the gap between that and being able to organize any kind of national political movement through party structures, through anything else. And, that's been probably the biggest single hurdle that was faced in the context of the coming to power of the Muslim Brotherhood as the organization that did have a national structure and did have a site of organization and a mosque and a mode of building forms of political hierarchy and loyalty and all those kinds of things. Just to come back to your question about coal and fracking, one of the things that many people have pointed out, the difference between coal politics and oil politics, was that in the era of large-scale dependence on coal, the energy source was incredibly visible. People dug it with their hands and they moved it, carrying things by hand, and the end user, which among other things was somebody putting coal into their fireplace in their house also. So at every point, from the coal face to the railway to the user, you're actually in contact with the form of energy. And one of the many things that changes with oil is that ceases to be the case, beginning again on the production phase and ending with the end user who holds a gas pump, a petrol pump, and doesn't even barely even sees the thing disappear into the tank of the car. And I think those, and you see that reflected, even at the level of say literature, enormous literature around the history of the novel, written about coal, from Dickens to Balzac to Orwell to many others, for whom. And you try and think of that for oil, and it's hard because there are one or two notable cases of sort of novels of oil, but compared to novels of coal, they're just not there. There's many other ways you can sort of trace that difference in the sort of tactile form and visibility, and therefore the objectness that is felt in this sort of source of energy. And the coal comes out of the ground in more or less in a state that's ready to use. I mean, that's part of the business, that the object you're using at the end in your fireplace is the same object that is brought out of the ground. But oil, even when it is used, a lot of it is in the form of those petrochemicals, of plastics, of fertilizers and so on, that it's very hard to make the connection visually and in a sort of tactile sense with its sources. I don't know if that tells us anything much about gas and fracking, though. One of the things about the politics of fracking is, of course, that I think has made political organizing around it more successful. By the sound of it, in Australia, I mean, this ludicrous situation in Britain where they decided to launch the fracking industry by drilling into one of the most beautiful bits of the just outside London. I mean, between London and the South Coast, right? I mean, of all places, it was fine when it was up in Lancashire somewhere. Nobody was going to bother about that, but do it right there in the home counties. It was, not a good move on the part of the fracking industry. But partly because was not just sort of extracting something out of the ground, as with earlier forms of either oil production or gas production, but that you're pumping something in, and that the whole politics is around what you're pumping in and then what is happening to that. And the trucks have to carry the water, pump it in, and then after it's done its work of fracturing the rock formation, the trucks have to drive it away again. So again, at that level of a kind of object politics, there's a remarkable difference between fracking as a process of energy production compared to, not necessarily compared to coal today, which is of course about mountaintop removal and things of that sort, but historically.
I think maybe that's a good point draw it to a close. Unless either of you may have particular comments that you'd like to add to each other, or only... Yes.
Very good.
Okay.
Exhausted everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.